Hi everyone, in this video we will be discussing the hormonal changes that occur during the menstrual cycle. So let's get started. So the way that this is usually taught is by a graph that shows you how these different levels of important hormones are fluctuating during the menstrual cycle. So on our y-axis, we will signify that the higher up we go, that means we're releasing more of whatever hormone that is. And on the x-axis over here, we have time. So as you probably know, the menstrual cycle is a cycle of 28 days. So we're going to start with 0/28, kind of because the last day is also the first day, if that makes any sense. So 0/28, 28/0. And then the middle, we're going to have day 14, which is smack dab in the middle. So first, let's kind of understand what is happening to our endometrium during this time. So let's have a section, let's have a section here where we talk about the endometrial lining. So when the menstrual cycle first starts, the female will be undergoing something called menses, which the more colloquial term for this is period. So this is the menses, and they will be shedding their endometrial lining. So they'll be shedding the endometrial lining, and actually that kind of shredding and ripping of the endometrial lining is what causes so many cramps and pain during the menses. So that's what's happening there. So the way you can kind of remember what's happening to the endometrial lining during menstruation is that menstruation is painful. So menses are painful, and you can kind of imagine that pain is coming from the fact that we're shedding this lining away. So if we're shedding something away, that's gonna hurt. So you can think of the menses as the shedding of the endometrial lining. But it's not just gonna stay like that after the menses. The endometrial lining will start to build itself up again. It'll start to build itself up. So when it starts to build itself up, that is called the proliferative phase. Proliferative phase. And it's called the proliferative phase because if we break it down, proliferative comes from the word proliferation. And proliferation, we can think of that as the as growth, as division of cells, division, replication. So we can kind of think of the proliferative phase as one where the endometrial lining is growing again. It's thickening again. So let's think about two ovarian hormones, and those are estrogen and progesterone. Let's think about what is happening with estrogen and progesterone during these two phases that we first started talking about. So as we are shedding our endometrial lining, we have kind of low amounts of both estrogen and progesterone, right? They're kind of low. So let's say red is estrogen, and let's say this purplish pink is progesterone. So P for progesterone and then E for estrogen. They're kind of low because if we think about the function of estrogen and progesterone, so estrogen, I like to think of it as estrogen establishes the endometrium, and progesterone protects the endometrium. But if we kind of think of it logically, we're kind of losing our endometrial lining here. So estrogen and progesterone are not really acting that much. So that's why those levels are kind of low over here. But once we enter our proliferative phase, we're going to see a nice big increase in estrogen as we're going through our proliferative phase. We're going to see an increase in estrogen. Why? Well, that's because estrogen establishes the endometrium. So it's established in the endometrium, it's growing the endometrial, it's thickening the endometrial lining. So that's why we see an increase in estrogen at that time. Now, if we go back to the endometrium, so once it is established, it will kind of remain like this. It will remain like this until we enter the last day or the first day of the menses again. And then it'll start to shed again, and then we'll have this whole cycle repeat again, right? So when we have it kind of remaining at this thickened state, we can kind of think of it being protected. So that's why the progesterone levels will still remain lower than estrogen during the proliferative phase, but then they'll start to increase again, and then they'll start to decrease again once the menses start again. And like I said, it's a whole cycle that continues to happen. So progesterone is remaining kind of low, but then it's going to shoot up once we are protecting the endometrium. The endometrium has been established by estrogen over here. That's why we're going to see a peak of estrogen over here, and then estrogen is going to go down again, and then kind of go up again to kind of help protect the, or establish and be part of the protection of the endometrial lining. So that's what's happening with estrogen and progesterone. Now you might be worried about, well, what are luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone doing? So these are hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary gland. Let's just quickly go over where these hormones are coming from. So we have the hypothalamus, which is kind of like the intersection between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So we kind of get neuroendocrine from there. So the hypothalamus is going to release GnRH, which stands for gonadotropin releasing hormone, and that's going to release that into the anterior pituitary gland, which this is the master endocrine gland. And it's going to cause the anterior pituitary gland to release both FSH and LH. And remember, FSH and LH are functional in males as well, but in this video we're specifically talking about the female menstrual cycle. So we're just going to be worried about what they're doing in females. So FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. So let's go here and let's make green is FSH. Now this first phase where we have the menses occurring and then we kind of have the proliferative phase starting. So we'll divide that between here, actually right before day 14 kind of. And we will be calling this whole thing the follicular phase. So that is when we'll kind of have a growing follicle, right? As we're kind of like growing our egg, we have like a growing follicle. So you can imagine that if we are growing our follicle, then our FSH levels, I mean, we're not shooting up or anything, but they're going to be quite high, right? But now, as you see over here, when we're getting this peak in estrogen happening over here, it's just going to dip a small amount. It's just, we see a little dip here. And that is because estrogen actually inhibits FSH and LSH. We will be going over that with LSH also. So let's make LSH in purple. So LSH is also going to dip a little bit here due to estrogen, because as estrogen increases, we get kind of a decrease in FSH and LSH, it's just LH, luteinizing hormone. So luteinizing hormone involves the formation of the corpus luteum, And the corpus luteum is actually what is going to secrete all of this progesterone in order to protect the endometrium, in order to protect the uterus for possible implantation of a zygote. So after fertilization occurs, if fertilization occurs, then pregnancy can occur due to the corpus luteum releasing progesterone. So you can imagine that since progesterone is released by the luteinizing hormone, you can imagine that, not by luteinizing hormone, by the corpus luteum. By the corpus luteum, you can imagine that the luteinizing hormone is not that high up until when we start to see this peak in progesterone. So we're going to start to see a little increase in luteinizing hormone right before we see that increase in progesterone, because luteinizing hormone is allowing for the formation of the corpus luteum, which, like I said before, allows for the secretion of progesterone. So let's go over that again so we don't get confused. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, we are going to see it higher than LH during the follicular phase, as we described it over here. It's going to be higher because we're developing a growing follicle. So if that's our egg, we're kind of growing a follicle around it. And then it's going to dip a little bit once estrogen is starting to increase, because estrogen inhibits FSH and LH. And now if we talk about LH, which is luteinizing hormone, we didn't get to the luteal phase yet, which kind of day 14 to day 28 is called the luteal phase. That's because that is where the corpus luteum is developing. So we're kind of just developing a corpus luteum over here, which is then going to allow for the secretion of progesterone. So that's why you see that as we're developing our corpus luteum here, that's where we're getting our peak in progesterone in order to protect the endometrium just in case of implantation. But then if implantation does not occur, this corpus luteum is just going to start to rupture away. And then it's going to get built up again once we go through this cycle again. Then we're going to get our follicle, and then we're going to get our corpus luteum later on. So LH is just going to increase a little bit before progesterone increase, and then it's just going to kind of remain at baseline levels again. Now you might be wondering, if estrogen is supposed to be inhibiting LSH and FSH, then why are we seeing a peak of LH over here? Well, because once estrogen gets so high, it does not inhibit. It does not inhibit FSH and LH. Instead, it has a positive feedback mechanism on them. So it causes more LSH and FSH to release. So don't get confused by the fact that just because estrogen inhibits LH and FSH when it starts to increase, that doesn't mean it's always the case. Once estrogen gets so high that it's peaking over here, it's going to peak over here actually, then we're going to see an increase in LH and also FSH. Also FSH, we're going to see a peak over there too. So right now we just know that there's peaks there, and then they're going to kind of settle around baseline again. But which peak is bigger? Which peak is bigger? And that involves what's happening at day 14, because we see these peaks happening at day 14. And day 14 is called ovulation. So this is when ovulation starts to occur. So ovulation is when we release the egg. So you know how we had our egg over here? We started growing a follicle around it? Well, ovulation is when that follicle bursts and then this egg gets released. So the egg is going to get released and it's going to hang out in the fallopian tubes in case fertilization occurs. But if it doesn't, it's just going to degrade and then it's just going to go away. It's just going to be released in the blood during the menses. And then the whole cycle is going to start again, as I said. So one thing that we need to memorize here regarding ovulation is that LH actually experiences a much bigger surge. LH experiences a much bigger surge than FSH during ovulation. So LH has a bigger increase. And also, the way I drew it here and the way it's drawn in most textbooks is that the LH surge is happening right at 14 days. But in reality, it actually occurs a little bit before. So LH surge occurs right before ovulation. So now we kind of have our whole picture forming together, right? We have our endometrial lining that is being shed during menstruation. And as it's starting to build up again, as it's starting to be established by estrogen, we see an increase in estrogen. And since an increase in estrogen inhibits FSH and LH, we kind of see decreases in FSH and LH. But then once estrogen gets so high, we start to see peaks because now it is acting as a positive feedback mechanism. And these peaks occur during ovulation, but the much larger peak is with LH, which occurs right before ovulation, and that is called the LH surge. Meanwhile, after the proliferative phase, once we enter the luteal phase, this is when the progesterone is going to protect the already established endometrium. So estrogen can start to go down a little bit, but it's still going to be a little bit higher so that we can keep establishing the endometrium and protecting it. And then we're going to see a huge increase in progesterone. And to kind of tie it in here to the luteal phase, like I said, the corpus luteum releases a lot of progesterone to kind of get the endometrium prepared in case of implantation. So that's why we see as the corpus luteum is forming with an increase in progesterone until we have our menses again, and then the whole cycle happens. And the menses will only occur again if no fertilization occurs. And like I said before, if no fertilization occurs, that means the corpus luteum will just degrade away. It'll just degrade away, and this egg that we release will just come out through the blood. But if the implantation does occur, so fertilization between a sperm and the egg do occur, then this is going to be continued to be built. We're going to continue secreting progesterone, and that's going to keep this lining protected, and we are not going to experience menstruation again until after birth of the child occurs. So those are the main hormonal changes of the menstrual cycle. I hope that was helpful.